Good evening, my name's Andrew Hills, and in tonight's instalment in the TOG series we're going to talk about the Committee and the Men. Now, the origins of the name are a little obscured by time, but the men designing the vehicle, when they received official approval and an official title, was the Special Vehicle Development Committee, or SVDC. The work of the SVDC would go well beyond just this tank, which you are mostly probably familiar with from that computer game. So dispel the idea of their work simply being just that tank, or that somehow any computer game relevant performance has any reflection on their skills and abilities or the rear vehicle. So it doesn't. So let's talk no more of that. Instead, I want you to think about the name of the committee. Special Vehicle Development Committee. Not standard vehicle or all-purpose vehicle, but special vehicles. So when you consider TOG work, look at it through that lens. These guys are being given the task of creating special vehicles for special purposes. The committee itself was formed from a nascent idea for a new tank which began in July 1939. And then a more formal approach by Sir Albert Stern to the Army on the 29th of August 1939 for a special tank. War was declared on the 3rd of September, which meant Britain had managed to get itself into a major European war with no heavy or particularly special tanks at all. It was 2 days later, on 5th of September, that Stern was informed that the Ministry of Supply, no doubt noticing that they were now in a war, welcomed his suggestion of a new tank, although they would not issue any specifications for what they would want for nearly a month. In the meantime, on the 13th, Stern managed to get Sir Edmund Ironside, he was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, to agree that his design did not need to go through the usually slow and ponderous channel, which was the mechanization board. That is, they didn't need to design it, get approval, build it, test it. In that sense, this was nothing sneaky. This was all with the blessing of the Minister of Supply. This was simply an expedient measure to meet a serious shortfall. Now, Sir Ernest Swinton, a good friend of Sir Albert Stern, was already on board with the project by this time, and no doubt using his considerable influence, making phone calls, meeting people, etc., to press the case for this vehicle. Stern, for his part, did not waste any time, and the as yet still unnamed committee met on the 6th of October with a rough outline for a tank which was not too dissimilar to a larger and heavier A12 Matilda, which was identified only by its drawing number 300G. It was not until the 10th of October that the Ministry finally managed to formally approve the committee, and on the 12th they named it the SVDC. By this time the group was already hard at work. Stern, as the chairman, formally appointed on the 13th, Sir Eustace Tennyson, Sir Ernest Swinton, Mr. Harry Ricardo, Major Symes, Mr. E.C. Pound, an Admiralty contractor, Major Wilson and Sir William Tritton, along with Messrs. Mertz and McClellan as consultants. A final and important addition was Mr. William Rigby from William Foster & Co., that's Sir William Tritton's firm, who came to the first official SVDC meeting on the 18th of October. This first meeting was crucial, setting out some of the general outlines for the tank, and was attended by Brigadier Kenchington from the War Office, along with Colonel Watson, who brought with them the tank concept from the General Staff. We'll come back to that when we cover the design philosophy. First and foremost to mention is Sir Albert Stern. Stern was a true powerhouse and driving force behind the project. Born in 1878, he was by 1940 62 years old. Educated at Eton and Christ Church College, Oxford, he became involved in World War I, helping to finance a fleet of armoured cars. At the time, armoured vehicle work was very much in the auspices of the Royal Naval Air Service. Through his work during the war on the Land Ships Committee, he rose from the rank of lieutenant all the way up to lieutenant colonel. He also had the title of Director of Tank Supply. On top of that, he also received a knighthood for his services during the war. Towards the end of the war, he was taken off the Landships Committee and became part of the Inter-Allied Tank Committee. Immediately after the war, he published a book called Logbook of a Pioneer, which covered his key work in the development of tanks during the First War. It has been suggested also by some that Stern had a personal enmity with Sir Winston Churchill, but bearing in mind he actually asked Sir Winston Churchill for a foreword to that book in 1919, that appears to be unlikely. He was well connected socially and politically, knowing Churchill, as well as the Prime Minister Mr. Lloyd George. He had even married well. Miss Helen Orr Lewis, married in April 1922. She was the daughter of Canadian businessman Sir Frederick Orr Lewis, the president of Canadian Vickers Limited, a major arms manufacturer. In 1939, though, it seems he was the first to really assess that a new European war was going to need new, special, powerful tanks rather than the designs currently in service. We will cover the philosophy behind designs in another part. Nonetheless, it is fair to say that the majority of tanks in British service were lightly armed or lightly armoured, or in some case, both. If, and that is a big if, war in Europe were to follow a similar path to the previous war, or even if it didn't, new, heavier, more powerful and specialised tanks would be needed and approved. The sooner they got started on the project, the better. Stern favoured a new tank which would offer protection and carry heavy firepower, and one crucially, most crucially, which would rely in terms of production on existing engines, transmission, guns and machining capacity. I think it's good to round off a comment on Sir Albert Stern with a quote about him from the book Portrait of an Inventor, which was written by Walter Wilson's son, quoting his father. He writes, "In his book, Admiral Sir Murray Souter refers to Stern as a man who thought big. This indeed seems true. He certainly never shirked taking big decisions, and if, as it turned out, his decision to order 500 electric drives was wrong, his next move, to order 700 of the more powerful Ricardo engines, was right. This incident was typical of what went on. Stern's committee disapproved of his actions and wanted to rescind it. Stern thereupon not only ignored their request, but increased the order to 1,400, observing that he would pay for them himself if needs be. He was battling to build tanks against a background of shortage of labour and materials and demands for aircraft, locomotives and guns, all deemed more important than his tanks. He never, for one moment, lost sight of his mission entrusted to him by Sir Douglas Haig to make all the tanks he could." General Sir Ernest Dunlop Swinton was a British officer of substantial experience. Born in 1868 in British India, he was the product of the English public school system, going to Rugby and Blackheath before the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich. His military career started in 1888 with the Royal Engineers, and he saw service in India before moving to South Africa during the Second Boer War, where his main role involved trains. Swinton enjoyed writing, and post-war wrote a short novel called The Defence of Duffer's Drift, a book often found in tactical studies to this day in the military. His Duffer's Drift might even be classifiable as science fiction, but he also wrote The Green Curve and other stories in 1909, and The Great Tab Dope and other stories in 1915, as collections which included stories set in the future, considering the changing nature of war. Those were published under the pseudonym Olluck Oy, a Danish fairy tale character. During World War I, Swinton was appointed as a military observer and correspondent on the front lines in France. He was later to write about the experiences in 1916 in An Eyewitness, Narrative of the War. In July 1915, he joined the Landships Committee, working on the very first tanks, where he became good friends with the chairman, Albert Stern. With his experience of the actual conditions in France at the front, he was able to provide some of the insight the committee was lacking about the sort of ground over which the tanks would have to pass. The committee had actually tried to see these conditions for themselves, but already had been stopped by the military from getting to the front, so could only see some of the behind-the-lines logistics issues. Even so, that limited information helped shape the future direction of tank design in World War I. Post-war, Swinton received a substantial award for his contribution to the development of tanks from the Royal Commission, and later travelled to the United States to meet Benjamin Holt, an event which helped Holt persuade many, especially in America, that he was somehow inventor of the tank, when he most certainly was not. After a no doubt rather lucrative trip to the United States and retiring from the army, he moved on to roles in the Air Ministry and then commercial work. He also became a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and in 1933 he published a book called Eyewitness and the Origin of the Tanks, followed by a lengthy series of magazines looking retrospectively 20 years after the battles of World War I. By 1940, Swinton, who had been knighted in 1923, was a man of substantial importance and influence. He'd also served as the Colonel Commandant of the Royal Tank Corps from 1934 to 1938, along with Field Marshals Sir Archibald Montgomery Massingberd and General Sir Hugh Ellis, a man who remained in that role through to 1945. Certainly Swinton knew all the right people, and even at the age of 72 was someone people would have to listen to. Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Earncourt. Born in 1868, his uncle was Admiral William Tennyson d'Earncourt, and he was a cousin to the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson. Educated at prep school at Ramsgate and then Charterhouse, he left age 18 to apprentice at the shipyards at Armstrong Whitworth & Co. in Elsick, Newcastle, rather than go to Oxford. Studying at Armstrong's for 2 years, he then went to the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, completing training in 1891 and moving back to Elsick to work under Sir Philip Watts for 7 years. In 1898 he went to work for the Fairfield Shipbuilding Engineering Company, studying merchant shipping. They were based in Govan in Glasgow, but by 1902 he was back at Elsick, and by 1904 he was heading up the design studio for Armstrong's. In 1912 he was appointed as Director of Naval Construction, no small responsibility for the world's foremost naval power. Under his direction no less than 21 capital ships, 53 cruisers, 133 submarines, and many others were added to the Royal Navy's rolls, as well as many others for other navies. During World War I he even moved to designing airships, and in 1915 was brought into the work of the Landships Committee by Sir Winston Churchill. He was chairman of that committee, and he stayed involved with tanks until after the war. Until 1917, his airship role kept him busy, and he even worked on the designs for R-33 and R-34. Perhaps an underappreciated legacy of his shipbuilding work was the below-the-waterline bulge developed to protect against enemy torpedoes, a design for which he too was rewarded post-World War I by the Royal Commission. Post-war, remaining involved in tanks, he stayed on the War Office Tank Committee as the Vice President, and in Admiralty matters was responsible for designs of ships like HMS Nelson and Rodney. Having been knighted for his work in 1917, he followed that with the election as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1921, and left the position of Director of Naval Construction in 1923 and the Admiralty in 1924. He then went back to work for Armstrong Whitworth & Co. In 1930 he was created a baronet, but in 1928 he'd already left Armstrong's to work at the Parsons Marine Turbine Company in Wallsend, until he finally retired in 1948. His retirement book was A Shipbuilder's Yarn, detailing his work and life as a naval architect. By 1940, he was 72 years old when he was working on the TOG program. His work was primarily involved in the manufacturing of the vehicles. Walter Wilson was a mechanical genius. Born in 1874, he worked as a cadet on HMS Britannia, and in 1894 entered King's College, Cambridge, studying mechanical sciences. Graduating in 1897, he went to work for Charles Rolls of Rolls-Royce fame, and early in his career he was interested in aviation, and he and Percy Pilcher and Adrian Verney Cave built an aero engine in 1898. Unfortunately, Pilcher was killed in an aviation accident in 1899, and Wilson gave up his aviation endeavours. He did, however, continue to manufacture the Wilson-Pilcher engines for cars, and using a novel gearbox with epicyclic gears. By 1904, he was at Armstrong Whitworth & Co., who were making the cars, and between 1908 and 1914 assisted in the design of the Halford lorry. During this time, he also developed an armoured gun tractor built at the Elsick Works. At the onset of World War I, Wilson joined the Armoured Car Division of the Royal Navy and ended up in charge of experimental work. Wilson is most notable during the war for his work with Sir William Tritton of Messrs. William Foster & Co. in Lincoln in solving the Great Track problem. That is, designing a robust all-steel track which would not sag away from its frame and which could stand up to environmental wear and tear of a tank rolling along the ground. He was also the brains behind epicyclic gearing in British tanks, greatly simplifying the whole process. It was he and Stern as young officers who perhaps directed the development of World War I tanks as much as anyone could claim to have done, with Stern as Director of Tank Supply and Wilson as Director of Engineering. He transferred to the Army in 1916, joining the heavy branch of the Machine Gun Corps, using tanks, and therefore becoming one of the more unusual breed of tank designers in that they actually got to use the tanks they helped to create. After the war, he invented a new type of gearbox where the gears would change automatically, and worked with various large automobile manufacturers to incorporate this new gear system. That was known as the Wilson Pre-Selector system and was first available in 1928 with the firm of Siddeley. They got that car into production using his gearing, and he manufactured those gears under the name Improved Gear Limited and later the Self-Changing Gear Company Limited. In short, the system used 4 separate gear sets, which the driver could select by means of a lever to pick which gear ratio he wanted. Upon the simple press of a pedal, the camshaft would disengage from one gear and engage simultaneously with the selected gear, meaning no loss of engine speed or power, making for seamless transmission of power. This type of system was famously the transmission system adopted for London buses, and from a military point of view on the post-war British Ferret armoured car, and the gearboxes stayed in production until the 1960s. Walter Wilson was literally the preeminent person at the time in the United Kingdom in automatic gearing in 1940 when he was 66. The end of the TOG program in which he was involved, however, in many ways crystallised Wilson's views that he was sidelined in favour of new tank designs, and his own tank project during the war, an A14 with a new transmission using the Thornycroft RY12 producing 548 horsepower, to create a large, very fast and very manoeuvrable cruiser tank, was written off when he was done with military work. He then just returned to his business ventures. Well, that's it for now. Those 4 men were the mainstay of the TOG programme, and if later there is time, I'd like to discuss the work of Sir Harry Ricardo and Sir William Tritton in more depth. For the time being, that is the SVDC and the main characters. And next we shall move on to design philosophy, i.e. why the vehicles started out the way they did. If you like this series on the TOG, or any other vehicles, or other items which I may cover, then please follow FWD Publishing on Facebook and on WordPress, or my author page at andrew.hills@amazon.com. Links are below in the description. There is also a Patreon page as well, if you'd be so kind as to make a donation to help support this channel, my work and my research, and further books. Thank you very much.